My guest today is John Fugelsang, an actor, a former VJ, a political commentator, and now an author. He has a new book out, a New York Times bestseller. It's essentially a challenge from the left against Christian nationalism and the political movement, as well as the ideological underpinnings that make it all possible. Without further ado, here's my conversation. John Fugelsang, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Luke.
It's great to talk to you. John, very quickly, if I may, I grew up on VH1. So this is a bit of a full circle moment for me. I recall seeing you back there many, many times as a VJ. But we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about your new book. Let me show it to the camera. Separation of Church and
You
Hate.
should at least give me a chance to defend myself for my VH1 crimes, but go ahead. Let's get to the book.
I'll come back to it. I'll give you a spot. But here is the book, A Sane Person's Guide to Taking Back the Bible from Fundamentalists, Fascists, and Flock Fleecing Frauds. Say that 10 times fast. That's a little bit of a difficult one. Let's start with sort of a very basic kind of overview, especially for the audience who is just hearing about this book for the first time. Why did you write this, and what is your relationship to the church?
Well, I have an abnormally Catholic background, I guess I would say. My mom was a nun for 16 years. She entered the convent right out of high school. She grew up in the segregated South and entered the Daughters of Wisdom order when she was 18. They put her through nursing school and eventually sent her off to Africa to work with lepers in Malawi as a nurse. My dad grew up in Brooklyn and in Flatbush, and he became a Franciscan brother out of high school, and he wore the Jedi robes and taught history to Catholic boys. My mother was briefly stationed in Brooklyn. My dad fell madly in love with her, even though he couldn't, and they stayed pen pals for about 10 years before eventually, finally, he got her to leave and go on a date. And so they tried to raise us to be progressive, free-thinking Catholics, albeit sexually repressed. And that's why I became a comedian, because I can't afford the therapy I need. And I was raised, like many, to believe that Christianity was about the things that Jesus talked about: service to others and forgiveness and going to the margins. And Matthew 25, he gives his marching orders to individuals and nations and says that individuals and nations will be judged by how they care for the poor, care for the sick, welcome the stranger, and are kind to those in prison. Nothing about screaming at women outside health clinics, nothing about persecuting migrants. And if you grew up in America in the late 20th century, early 21st century, you probably had a confusing experience learning that Jesus was about love and welcoming others. And the way you treat the lowest is the way you treat Jesus, you know, the stuff in the Gospels. And then you would turn on the TV and you would see these blow-dried televangelists and these refried segregationists like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, the people that the TV introduced to us as the Christian leaders. And these fundamentalists, they didn't talk about helping the poor at all. They talked about welfare queens. They didn't talk about going to the less fortunate. They talked about bums on welfare. And they talked about AIDS patients being dangerous and feminists and abortions and homosexuals. None of the love of Christ. And this is sort of why I think so many have felt alienated from a church in America that seems on the surface to be all about MAGA and nothing whatsoever to be about Christ. Now, of course, that's not all churches, but generally, by the time I got to college, if you told someone you were Christian, they assumed you hate gay people and you think that rape victims who get pregnant should be forced to remain pregnant by the government. And Christianity got a bad name, and everyone assumed that I was a bigot. I didn't understand. I thought, no, I love gay people. I love everybody. What? And this is where we're at right now with modern American Christianity, 1/4 of the way through the 21st century. And it may seem like it's a strange mutation. How can these folks get behind Donald Trump? How can a rapist, an unrepentant racist, a liar, a guy who had cops beaten on the Capitol steps for a lie, who stole from vets with a fraudulent online university? I mean, we could spend all day talking about this guy. He didn't get the evangelicals to go with him by promising to do anything Christ did. He didn't say, I'm going to fight for the things our Lord commands. He promised to put them first. And that's always been the curse of Christianity ever since Rome took over the movement, where it's not about the teachings of Christ. It's about conservative Christian power over culture, over society. So my very long-winded answer to your question is we're in a time now where right-wing Christianity only fights for right-wing Christianity and legislates and votes against the actual things Christ says. And I got tired of seeing my mom and dad's religion used as a cloaking device for cruelty and meanness. And I happen to know the Bible quite well. And for years, I've talked about it as a comedian, as a broadcaster, on television, on radio. It's not the most commercially viable subject matter, but I was called to it for a long time. And I had this book idea for years. I pitched it for many years. And, it was meant to be a guide for believers and non-believers, anyone who's ever going to have to deal with a right-wing Christian fundamentalist or Christian nationalist. Because even if you're atheist, if you're debating the issues that divide us with a right-wing Christian, chances are Jesus is probably on your side. So the book is about the issues that divide us, from uh, uh, our economic policy and social safety nets and healthcare policy, gun safety legislation, LGBTQ rights, transgender rights, feminism, women's reproductive freedoms, um, anti-Semitism, racism. And it shows how the right has strayed very far from Christ, and it gives you the actual Jesus teachings, and it actually shows you how to debate the right-wing Christian, because I find if we engage them on scripture, they will appreciate sometimes that you took the time to actually talk to them about what Jesus said. These folks haven't read the Bible that much. I mean, you can't vote for Donald Trump and read the New Testament a lot and think that works. They haven't read the Bible. They're counting on the rest of us not having read the Bible. And I think we do better showing our racist uncle that Jesus was not an immigrant hating homophobe than if we just call our uncle an immigrant hating homophobe.
You mentioned Rome and the role that that would play in how we got to our present moment of a kind of national, well, not just a nationalized, but as a political force, a kind of version of Christianity. Can you trace that for us? How did, this is now a long time ago to today's moment, what is the through line?
Yeah, I mean, I spend a lot of time on Paul, and my next book is going to be a lot about Rome and about authoritarian Christianity. But that was the moment. I mean, when the Roman Empire, which had executed Jesus, we're taught it was the Jews, but it was a Roman governor, a Roman cell, a Roman scourging, Roman nails, Roman crucifixion site, Roman method of crucifixion, Roman soldiers driving the nails, Roman soldiers hanging a sign mocking Jesus for his Judaism. No one ever says the Italians killed Jesus, but Rome murdered Jesus. And 300 years later, they took over his operation, and it became the state religion of the Roman Empire, which is incredible to think about. I mean, the rate of turnover. Jesus's friends all got bumped off by Paul's old friends, but Paul was very successful at spreading the message of the kingdom because Paul was a Pharisee and he was also a Roman citizen. So while Jesus's apostles were all being murdered by Saul's buddies back home, Saul, now Paul, was able to make his version the one that stuck for the Roman Empire. And Saul brought the homophobia, he brought the hangups about women and authority. So when Rome takes over, Christianity goes from being this persecuted little Jewish sect named for this brown-skinned faith healer who hung around the poor neighborhoods in Galilee. And now it's an imperial religion. Now it's a movement with the power to oppress others, not just be oppressed. And that's what began. The Crusades were the beginning of this long authoritarian Christian tradition of doing the exact opposite of what Jesus says for Jesus. So suddenly, Jesus's movement is authorizing war. God wills it, Deus vult. And the Christians with an army are slaughtering pagans and slaughtering Jews and slaughtering Muslims to reclaim land, all of which is a stark rejection of everything Jesus ever talked about. And this began the tradition of profoundly, revoltingly fake Christianity that exists not for the way Christ told us to treat each other, but again, for power. And then you go to the Vatican and the doctrine of discovery, which led to Columbus. And suddenly you see Columbus slaughtering and raping and mutilating the Taino people, but in the shadow of the cross, right? Like, we're doing it for Jesus. We're going to convert them to Christianity. But as we saw with the slaves and as we saw with the Indians, being saved didn't save them. But the amazing thing is, as soon as Christianity becomes an imperial force for conquest, the Christ followers start resisting. And St. Francis of Assisi spends a year in a prison during the Crusades, but then renounces violence, renounces war, devotes himself to nonviolence, to nature, to the teachings of Christ, to poverty, walks unarmed through a war zone to negotiate peace talks between a Muslim sultan and a Crusader army. The sultan later said, if all Christians were like this man, I would convert. As Columbus is slaughtering the indigenous people in Hispaniola, it was the Catholic priest on his third ship, Bartolomeo de las Casas, who committed what may have been the first act of protest by a white person in this hemisphere, writing to the Queen to protest the way he was treating the indigenous folks. This goes through civil rights, slavery. Slavery is propped up by Christianity, but there's Frederick Douglass and the Quakers and Harriet Tubman. Segregation propped up by Christianity. There's Dr. King using scripture. Hitler is the ultimate Christian nationalist. There's Bonhoeffer. Every time Christian authoritarianism does the opposite of Christ and engages in cruelty for power, you will always see the real Christians, the real Christ followers, and their allies always resisting.
Let me follow up on that, because I was thinking about that in reading parts of your book and hearing some interviews you gave in promoting it, which was as a general proposition, I found it to be very instructive, right? Where you have these very studious Christ followers pushing back against this more kind of militant political Christian identity and pressure, right? But I guess my question would be, in the cases where the Christ followers, in your judgment, were successful in pressing back, are there any common lessons we can learn? Because let me just, as a thought experiment, throw this out at you. One of the guys I've been reading a lot about in the last couple of years has been John Brown. And his raid, right, was this sort of slave rebellion, but he murdered a bunch of people.
Murdered a bunch of people. Yeah,
he
went Old Testament on Old Testament.
He certainly did, and he was very, very pious. And I think history has, in large part, exonerated, if not the methods of what he did, the spirit certainly of pushing back against this monstrosity that was slavery.
It's very emotionally gratifying for people who hate slavery to read about John Brown.
But you can't take a lot of lessons from that in the modern context, because no one is really suggesting that that's an appropriate response to our present moment. So I guess going back to the original question, what lessons have you learned in watching successful pushback through these Christ followers in these larger efforts?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there's many examples where it fails. I mean, Bonhoeffer died, the people who tried to resist Franco's Christian fascism in Spain. There's so many examples of noble martyrs who I mean, Dietrich Bonhoeffer gave his life for Jews. He was a true Christ follower up against Hitler. Dr. King is really the greatest example we have in the history of Christianity, of an activist who actually used the scripture and the teachings of Christ and nonviolence. Dr. King was the anti-John Brown. And look, I love John Brown's story. It's plenty of fun. And you can imagine how he treats certain folks today. But he wasn't living the gospel. He was fighting evil with evil. He was fighting hate with hate. And that just means it's a failure. I mean, it might feel good, but John Brown wasn't around long after that. That was the end of his ministry. Dr. King used nonviolence, and with his allies was able to shame Christian America out of this mutually destructive apartheid of segregation. And he did it using media culture, using nonviolent means like boycotts, and by organizing with secular folks as well. We can't overstate how often throughout history it's been people of faith having alliances with secular forces, be they universities, be they legal aid, be they political forces. I mean, look at what the church did against communism in Poland with Lech Walesa. That was trade unionists and the church. And churches have always worked with civil rights movements because churches can provide infrastructure. They might not have the political know-how or the collection or the connections, but they have the veneer of respectability. They have the meeting places. They often have congregants of very willing volunteers. And throughout history, we see a lot of great alliances between atheists and believers of other faiths. But the greatest example I've seen in my life was what happened after the AIDS crisis. I mean, when we were kids, you can remember this, there was no such thing as homophobia. There's no
Hmm.
such thing as homophobia. There was normal people, and there were filthy homosexuals hiding in alleys waiting to get us straight guys. And that was the reality we were all raised in. And it was justified because, hey, it's in the Bible somewhere. No one ever took me aside as a kid to say that homophobia, being prejudice towards gay people, is a rejection of Jesus. You cannot live by the Sermon on the Mount and practice homophobia. No one ever came to me and said, oh, by the way, Christians don't follow Leviticus. That's meant for the Jews surviving in the desert for 40 years after bondage. Jesus brought a new covenant. So just like we don't stone people to death for working on Saturdays anymore, we don't stone them to death for being gay either. No one told me any of that. I just knew being gay was bad. And I was lucky as a teenager. I was a horrible homophobe, but I was working in theater. And by the age of 13, I realized that I was a dick and that I knew lots of gay men and I loved them. But what we saw in the AIDS crisis in this country was astonishing because in the beginning, what we saw was fear. And we saw many, many, many people loudly boasting of their own Christian piety, being as cruel as possible to people living with HIV, be they gay or be they someone who got it from a blood transfusion. We saw families chased from churches. We saw children persecuted. I mean, kids today have no idea how scary it was. People, you could get fired from being gay. People thought you could get AIDS if you ate off the plate of a gay person. I mean, this is what the reality was. It was a year, 20,000 Americans died before America's president ever mentioned the disease. Can you imagine 20,000 Americans dying from something before the president ever says the name of the disease out loud? That was the America we grew up in the 80s. And then what happened? Well, our gay brothers and sisters stopped waiting for the government to come and help them and began demanding their own rights and demanding their own equality. And heterosexual brothers and sisters came out as allies and they marched. They had a lot of protests that made me very uncomfortable as a Catholic teenager. A lot of what ACT UP did really rubbed me the wrong way. Today, I think it was brilliant. It was designed to make a comfortable straight person like me uncomfortable. But what did we witness from AIDS activism? The swiftest civil rights advancement for any oppressed minority in the history of the world. And gay people are an oppressed minority within every minority. And yet by coming out and by good clergy embracing people with HIV, by having many Christian leaders and many Christians, and let's not forget the celebrities who came and lent their names as well as allies, but it was an incredible, incredible movement where people overcame their fear, did exactly what Christ commands of us, even though Leviticus as being gay is bad, but we chose love. People doing AIDS walks. My first time I did the AIDS walk, my two best friends from Long Island withdrew their pledges when they found out it went to gay men's health crisis, because I can't do that as a Christian, yo. You can't help people with AIDS as a Christian? Christ never condemns gay people. And in the book, I go into a couple of instances where Christ validates gay people. But that's why I don't get to be a cynic, because I witnessed that. And America led the way. And it happened because of a plague. I miss the civil rights movement. I miss seeing hippies and Crosby, Stills, and Nash and the Vietnam War. But within one generation of the AIDS crisis, you saw a sitting American president endorsing marriage equality during his reelection bid in 2012. That's an incredible amount of social progress in a very short amount of time.
I am not. I was like most Americans. I was nominally raised Christian. I no longer practice. I have no quarrel with any of the Abrahamic religions, but I don't
Same.
follow them.
Yeah.
Super closely.
I try to follow Jesus, not the fan clubs.
Fair enough. Fair enough. There's quite a bit to learn there, certainly. One thing I have noticed, and again, I'm saying this as someone who is not as keen an observer of these communities as perhaps you might be. We're talking about this kind of sort of vexing problem of Christian nationalism. I don't want to say that that it is strictly a Protestant problem, but it does appear to be that evangelicals are more aligned with these kinds of politics, or at a bare minimum, political aims and machinery. Whereas I have seen this pope, but then
plenty
pope,
of Catholics, though. Plenty of Catholics are on board with this. But
fair enough. So I guess I would ask then, what do you make of, to the extent that okay, let me ask it this way. To the extent as someone with my background has observed someone within the clergy or the church more broadly push back against some of the creep, not so much of Christian nationalism, but the kind of vice that surrounds it. It's been from this pope and then the last one. Is that a fair observation? And if so, what does that say?
I mean, it tells me that the Vatican is finally beginning to grow up in my lifetime. I'm astonished by this new Pope already. And I was astonished by Francis. Let me tell you why I'm most astonished by this Pope. Chicago Pope, deep dish pontiff. I love that. I'm a comedian. I love this guy. I mean, a Pope will forgive your sins and help you hide a body. Who doesn't love it? I just imagine the Chicago Pope, when mass is ended, instead of saying the mass is ended, let us go in peace. This guy's just like, all right, we good, we good.
Yeah.
But when I was growing up, I lived half New York, half Southern, and that was my parents. And I spent a lot of time in churches in the North and in the South. Spent a lot of time in churches in New York City and in the South. And what I learned about the Catholic faith is it's a business, and they will send the conservative priests to the conservative areas and the liberal priests to the liberal areas, because at the end of the day, a big part of the job is getting the old ladies to open up their pocketbooks and give as much money as possible. So a lot of it's just casting, and you want to have the right priest for the right parish. So I would go to the Catholic Center at NYU, and I would see gay couples welcomed and embraced by this church. And then I'd hop on a flight and go down south and see my family, and there would be all the homosexuals and the AIDS and the sin, fire and brimstone. And a lot of it's casting. Um, for this Pope to come out and actually live by the gospel. The God of the Old Testament is unambiguous about welcoming the stranger. God multiple times says, you must welcome the stranger, for you were strangers in Egypt. God says it like 4 times in the Hebrew scriptures, and commands us to treat the alien as one of our own. Now, I'm not saying that we should have open borders or amnesty. That was Ronald Reagan fought for that. But I don't like seeing the criminalization of migrants. Calling these folks illegals is vulgar and dehumanizing, and it's exactly what Hitler did to make people think another powerless minority weren't really human. I call them Christian refugees because it really pisses off the right people. And Jesus commands us, heaven or hell, individuals and nations, in the judgment of nations, Matthew 25, to welcome the stranger. So what we're witnessing here is persecution of brown people. There's 50,000 undocumented Irish in this country. Are you seeing any Irish go to Alligator Alcatraz? You seeing any of the undocumented Russians in the ICE dragnets? These are the people who come here because there's a help wanted sign at our border. The majority of folks who are undocumented are people who overstay their visas, but they're going after border crossers, the brown people who come because men like Donald Trump, who has hired undocumented immigrants in 2 different centuries to avoid paying an American worker a living wage, guys like that put a gigantic help wanted sign at our border. And it's never coming down. Donald Trump has a carve out for agricultural sector workers to keep the grocery prices low. They're letting those illegals stay here right now. Our economy is propped up by this lie, by this exploited labor, generally of marginalized brown people. And Democrats are terrified to talk about it. For this Pope to come out and call this out, and to say that you're not a Christ follower if you're endorsing this persecution of migrants, who commanded us to welcome the stranger. That's the only law about borders in the entire Bible. That's it. I mean, they'll tell you Nehemiah built a wall, but that was to rebuild Jerusalem, not to keep refugees out. So for the Pope to do this means he's willing, in his first few months on the job, to be unpopular with all the conservative racist Catholics in this country who like seeing brown people rounded up, who like watching ICE coward thugs in masks chase brown kids around church picnics. This Pope was really risking having a lot of people not put their money in the basket, Luke. This Pope was making a business choice to
Mm.
potentially hurt the bottom line and outrage the shareholders by coming out and choosing the gospel over political expediency. I'm stunned that this guy did it, because to me it represents a lot of pissed off Catholics leaving a dent in the church's bottom line. And this guy didn't care. I take tremendous comfort for the Catholic Church's future, knowing that Pope Francis picked most of these cardinals. Now, they've got light years to go on women and gay people and sexuality in general. I mean, just this week, they said they don't think women should be allowed to be deacons. It's like, Jesus brought 3 women everywhere with him in the 12, but the men who wrote the book said, oh no, it's 12 apostles, 3 groupies. Jesus is the biggest feminist in the book, but this is the Vatican, no knob, no job. But what this new Pope has done is a lot of like what Francis has done. They have chosen the Gospels, they have chosen love, they have chosen service over politically expedient popular cruelty that could have endeared them more to right-wing Christians here in America. I'm shocked.
One, yeah, just the same, but pleasantly surprised, I suppose, but
Yeah,
surprised just the same.
yeah.
One thing that I really want to get at in from reading this book is a question that was nagging me the whole time. I'm going to make a terrible analogy, but it will be instructive. So just let me get it out if I may.
Please.
Like most idiots, I had a libertarian phase at one point in my political development, and someone recommended to me that I read the works of Ayn Rand. I read some of them, not all of them, but I read many of them. But there was a big debate in her community after she died because she had left these books that she had written, plus some works that were directly devoted to philosophy. Again, I'm not espousing them. I'm giving a sort of
I
a
gotcha.
setup here. And her handpicked successor was this guy named Leonard Peikoff. And a big debate emerged because what he said was, no. The works of Ayn Rand and her views are what she expressly says in these books. Whereas there was another interpretation, which was like, well, okay, how can we take these lessons and then apply it to a modern context?
Right.
I say all of that to say, how do you, one of the points you make is that a lot of people who claim to be Christians just simply have no idea what Jesus actually said. Fair enough.
It's in the
But
Bible somewhere, right? It's in the
right.
Bible.
But I guess my point would be, or I guess my question rather would be, how do you navigate this? How do you navigate a world where some vision and some morality is clearly articulated, but there has to be gaps in that with respect to our modern political environment?
Give me
So
an example. Give me give me an example of
AI
where there'd be a gap.
regulation.
That's a good one. Yeah. Well, I mean, look, I think if you're looking at AI regulation, that's factually really fun. I just had to do a piece on that because here we finally created God in our own image yet again, haven't we? And in the case of AI regulation, I think there's a lot of Christ in it if we think about mindfulness towards the less fortunate, mindfulness towards the poor, not exploiting people. If AI is a vehicle to help the poor, to help the sick, and I think that there's a lot of good that can be done with medical diagnoses and AI technology, then I think great. It's a tool for Christianity. It's a tool like the wheel to bring a sick person to the hospital is a tool for Jesus's mission. But when it gets into lying and twisting and brainwashing people, when AI becomes a tool of the false prophets, which it already is. And when AI, of course, wreaks its environmental toll, we don't even begin to talk about these processing centers yet. We haven't really yet measured the full punch that AI is going to have on our society. It's still in its infancy. And I'm inclined to try to be optimistic and hopeful about it. I don't think AI is ever going to be better than human beings, but I think maybe AI will make being human better. And hey, wouldn't a couple of violent robot uprisings be worth that? But for me, it's an exciting time of trying to see how unholy this will be. But I still find Jesus's teachings apply. I mean, with the transgender debate, I find Jesus's teachings apply. I more and more
Help
I
me understand that one, or at least the audience watching. How would you, again, navigate that what appears to be a modern context outside of what happened 2,000 years ago?
Sure. Well, I mean, first off, Jesus is very, very direct about how you treat the lowest of the low is how you treat him. So that should be enough, I think, for most folks. The golden rule, what's in the Sermon on the Mount, all of that to me is you know forbids you from having any kind of homophobia. But it goes deeper than that because I think in many ways the transgender debate is a wonderful test for modern Christians. Last year, the Southern Baptist Convention voted to deny that transgender people even exist. And they say
Mhm.
bisexuals are confused. But every generation of American Christians, right, seems to need a new marginalized group that feels righteous to persecute. When I was a kid, it was feminists or gay people. 20 years ago, it was Muslims. It was okay to persecute them. And now it's the illegals and it's transgender people, especially children. Um, and being transgender is not mental illness. A lot of trans folks grow up in communities that cause mental illness because they're despised. A lot of Christians are now trying to use religious freedom laws to have businesses deny services to transgender tax-paying citizens based on their religious beliefs. And They don't have religious beliefs that justify cruelty to trans people. They'll say, male and female, he made them. Jesus, Matthew 19. Well, male and female, he made them is Jesus coming out against heterosexual divorce, not gay marriage, not transgender people. So if you're supporting Donald Trump, you don't believe in Matthew 19, and you probably support legal heterosexual divorce. You can't groom a kid to be transgender, but you can groom a douchebag to believe he's Christian. And love your neighbor as yourself is a commandment, not a suggestion. And there's this great passage in John chapter 9, because Jesus lived in a time when people confused biological phenomena that they couldn't understand with divine punishment. People thought leprosy was a punishment from God, or blindness was a punishment from God. And there's this whole chapter where they walk by this blind guy, and the apostles are saying, "Hey, Jesus, who did this to this guy? Did he sin, or did his parents sin, and that's why he's blind?" And Jesus says, None of the above." He's like, "Neither has this guy sinned nor his parents, but that the work of God should be made manifest in him." So who the hell are these right-wing Christians to say that being born gay or being born trans or being born intersex are sins rather than more of the work of God, that we might witness God's works through them as well? That's sort of the plot of the movie Conclave that came out last year. If you're looking for any kind of Christian excuse to justify cruelty to a marginalized group, you're not being Christian. Transgender people are exactly the folks who could use a religion based on love and compassion and service to fly to their rescue right now. Just as the true Christ followers would be welcoming the migrants with water and blankets, the true Christ followers would be standing up for the dignity of their transgender brothers and sisters. And by the way, if I can even, Paul, letter to Galatians, there's neither male nor female in Christ. So it's like, as long as you hate, there'll be people to hate. It's not covered under Jesus's plan. Sorry, Luke.
No, worries. I'm glad you brought up Paul, because one of the sort of interesting parts about this book, my brother actually did some religious studies and told me about this years ago. So it was really actually quite kind of interesting to hear you bring it back up, which was there is what Jesus taught. And you referenced this earlier in a different point when discussing Rome.
Yeah.
And then there's basically Paul just remixing it for his own purposes, and yet that having a vast greater degree of historical influence. And so this is why I want to get back to that question of like, what does he actually believe versus what do people think that he actually believes? And there seems to be this wedge in between them. In terms of just debating people, that's one mechanism to convince them. The book is another. But for the average person, how do they tell people in their midst, particularly Christians, that you've got it confused? You guys are believing a kind of different remixed version of this that is not actually adherent to what the original prophet said.
Well, here's what I say. Christians aren't supposed to follow the Bible. They're supposed to follow Christ. The Bible gives you instructions on how to trade your 10-year-old for a goat if you look hard enough. The Bible tells you how if you rape a virgin, you can pay her dad, so you have to marry her and make it all okay. You can marry your rape victim. That's what the Bible tells us. The Bible tells us you should stone people to death if they gather sticks on a Saturday. That's okay. Christians follow Christ. It's pretty simple. And I didn't think when I was writing this that I was going to have to do a whole chapter on Paul, Luke. I didn't think so, but I realized, my God, you can't write a book about what Christianity started out as and what it turned into without having a whole chapter about Jesus's conservative, sexually uptight PR guy who never met Jesus. And Paul has a lot of beauty in his language. He's, for better or worse, the reason why Christianity is what it is today. But, Jesus was the ideas man. Paul was the startup guy who built the doctrines, who built the hierarchy, who set up the churches, who traveled around setting up these churches, getting volunteers, writing letters, directing. He set the whole thing up. And again, as I said earlier, while this was happening, Paul's old Pharisee buddies were murdering the apostles back home. The guys that actually knew Jesus were all getting bumped off. So what do you know? Paul's version of this Jewish sect is the one that survived. And Paul's version survived because he thought outside the tribe. Jesus's movement was Jewish. He never stopped being Jewish. The first account of his life were all written by Jews. The first 20 people to preach his name after he died were all Jewish. It was a Jewish sect. Paul said, let's go for those Gentiles. And Paul began selling it, saying, well, it's like Judaism, but there's eternal forgiveness, and you can have bacon, and you can keep your
Mm.
foreskin. And it was really popular, like 3 to 4% turnover rate per decade within 300 years. Within 300 years, the empire that executed Jesus took over his operation. I mean, that would be like if the Confederates took over Lincoln's Republican Party. But it happened. And there's cultural appropriation, and then there's taking over the fan club of a guy you bumped off. So Paul's letters have all of Paul's hangups, right? Christ is a feminist, treats women equally, biggest feminist in the Bible. Paul says at some points, Paul says that women have to be submissive and should never talk in church. But then elsewhere, Paul makes women deacons. So it's almost like different guys are writing these letters, or Paul's writing it to different people with different problems. 300 years later, after Paul is murdered by Rome, the Council of Nicaea is putting together the Bible, and they start deciding which parts go and which parts leave, and Paul's letters become an official part of the Bible. So suddenly, St. Paul and all his homophobia and all of his woman hating and all of his hang-ups, St. Paul's letters talking about Holy Scripture are Holy Scripture. Suddenly, Paul's letters about God are Paul speaking for God. So anyone who ever uses the New Testament to justify cruelty to gay people, I can guarantee you they're quoting Paul, not Christ. And
Mm.
once you learn to check what they're citing, you will notice that our conservative brothers and sisters quote Paul a whole lot more than they ever quote Jesus. In fact, you will never see a conservative Christian or right-wing Christian group fight to put any quotes of Jesus on a classroom wall or a courthouse wall. They'll go for the Ten Commandments, all of which Donald Trump has broken, and they voted for him anyway, which means they don't believe the Ten Commandments. It's all about control, patriarchy, authority, and Jesus represents liberation. Jesus came to free the oppressed. Jesus's teachings are as threatening to authoritarian power now as they were 2,000 years ago.
We live in a moment where I think we would probably both agree that here, for example, we have Democratic backsliding with Roe v. Wade being overturned, and
I wouldn't call that
just
Democratic backsliding, but yeah. I mean,
backsliding of a certain
if
kind.
you want to say Barack Obama should have fought a lot harder to put Merrick Garland on the Supreme Court, yeah, but I
Yeah,
blame Republicans for that.
there is certainly that element as well. But we also probably would both agree that this threat of Christian nationalism, I grew up in the 80s and 90s as well. It's not new, but the threat of it feels a little more heightened today than it once did.
Yeah.
And yet we live at a moment where for some time now, church attendance is declining. People might still identify in some kind of way as Christian, but their Christian going habits, at least as church attendance is concerned, is way down. How do you reconcile these two things happening simultaneously?
Well, back in the 90s, we were like 90% Christian, and now we're about, maybe 2/3. And 2022 was the first year in recorded American history that religious participation dipped below 50%. And I don't think young people are being turned off to religion because of God or Jesus or Noah's Ark or Christmas or Santa Claus. They're turned off to the meanness. They're turned off to the hypocrisy and the cruelty. And, I think if churches want to get young people to come join them, well, there's ways to do that. But a lot of this is just white supremacy at this point. A lot of this is the fact that Caucasians are going to be a minority population in 2045. And the unpleasant reality is that America is the only nation on earth where our Christianity is historically intertwined with white supremacy. And we're witnessing it now with these ICE raids. Again, they ain't going after the Irish undocumented in New York City. They're not going after the Russian undocumented. They're not welcoming the stranger. They are becoming a minority. They are flipping out. They are heavily armed. They are not interested in following Jesus. They are interested in power. And that is why you're seeing a lot of these policies being enacted right now. Now, you could do some Eisenhower-style taxation of the wealthy and have a stronger social safety net and let young people in their 20s feel like they could afford to have babies again. After the war, you could have all the babies you wanted, and you would know that you could afford a home, and you'd have health care, and you could go to school, and you can get a job, and the rich were being taxed. That was how it was in the good old days. We don't have that anymore, and people can have kids. They're terrified to have kids. They can't afford to have kids. We could change things and make it so you are creating more white people, but they don't want to do that. It's controlled by wealth and power, and rich people pay Fox people to make working people blame poor people. So it's going to get meaner. They're going to get crazier over the next several years, and it's going to become more important than ever for people who have actually read the Bible or read the Jesus parts to elegantly point out that right-wing Christianity does not follow Christ and does not follow any of his teachings. They fight for their own power in his name. And we're going to need people to be nicer than ever because these people are going to get crazier than ever. We can't hate them, but in a democracy, we have to beat them. And they are going to be panicking for the next 20 years and cheating as hard as they can to make sure that even after whites dip below 50%, whites will still rig the deck for many generations to come. And again, love is easier. And if the church wants to survive in the 21st century, well, you know what? Fighting racism, fighting bigotry, fighting for the poor, fighting for healthcare, fighting for justice, fighting against cruelty and police brutality, fighting for labor rights, fighting for proper stewardship of the environment God has given us. These are all really popular things with young people that align quite nicely with the teachings of Christ, who never came out against abortion. And we didn't even talk about abortion, but that's the culprit in all of this, Luke, because it was, after Dr. King, after Nixon and Watergate, the right-wing Christians, Jerry Falwell was a segregationist. They were adrift in the 70s for 10 years. Their big issue in the 70s was Jimmy Carter's IRS going after universities that practiced racial segregation. Like, they were still fighting for separation of the races in the 70s. It was only after Reagan's election when abortion became the number one issue. And they realized that, hey, they could consolidate people with abortion just like they did with segregation. And so the fact that the Bible's not against abortion, God never says a thing about abortion, God never has anyone in the Bible mention abortion. There's no penalty for ending a pregnancy. Christ never mentions it. Judaism doesn't ban it. Abortions are legal and free in Israel right now because the Bible doesn't ban them. Most Americans don't know this. And that is how they did it after Reagan. That's how they consolidated it. That's how, for 2 generations now, Christianity has meant you want to put people in jail for ending a pregnancy. And that's the greatest thing they've achieved in my lifetime, Luke. They got the followers of Jesus to vote against everything Jesus ever said because of something Jesus never talked about.
Last one from me. It's a request for you to lay out a vision for the future. One of the things that I'm sure many people have their eye on, and I'm sure you and I as well, is the Groyper movement, right? And Nick Fuentes is at the front of it, and he always says, "Christ is King, Christ is King, Christ is King."
Yeah, he's a fucking liar. That guy. He's a
when you hear him
hating little Hitler fucking simian troll. That
okay,
guy. But go on.
When you hear him
language.
Okay, no worries. When you hear him say that, and then you see the political threat on the horizon, walk me through what the future looks like, you think?
Oh, we have to, John Lennon said the things fascists can't handle are nonviolence and ridicule. And we have to ridicule these people. And I wrote this book because it's more important than ever to show that simian child men, Nazis like Nick Fuentes, are not Christ followers. They wave Christ around like a prop to get more power, to get more money. Christ is currency to them, but they despise his teachings. What freaking teachings of Christ does Nick Fuentes follow? I mean, Jesus forbids us from executing people. Jesus commands us to welcome the stranger. These right-wing Christians haven't read the Bible. They think I put up a tree in my house once a year and I hate Muslims and trans people, and that's enough. They think that respecting Charlie Kirk makes you a Christ follower. I've been through Turning Point USA's website. I can't find nothing there about how we're going to help the poor. They don't give a rat's ass about Christ and the things Christ said. Christ is a prop these people wave over their heads like the Bible. So the media is never going to take this message. The media is never going to call these frauds out. I never once saw any journalist ask Mike Pence, "Hey, Mr. Vice President, where does Jesus drive the gay wedding cakes out of the temple?" The media just assumes it. Oh, you're Christian. They're Christian. They're against abortion. They're Christian. They never say where in your holy book does Jesus say it's a good idea to force rape victims to be pregnant by their stepdad? Show me. And the Democratic Party won't do it. They are too terrified. So it's going to be up to the rest of us to convince these other people, to convince other Americans, to convince atheists and believers of all faiths that hate is not a Christian value. And if you're fighting against the stuff Christ actually commanded, but call yourself Christian, well, then you need to find a new name for your group. If I'm in a Rolling Stones cover band and we only do songs by Vanilla Ice and Nickelback, I need to find a new name for my shitty group. And if these people are not going to follow Christ, let them find a new name for their movement. Boom.
The book is fantastic. It's out now. It's a bestseller, by the way. Here it is one more time: Separation of Church and Hate by John Fugelsang. John, what a treat this was! Congratulations!
Thank you. I'm so
on
honored. You do such a great, smart show. I'm really thrilled that you would invite me here to drag it all down to my level, Luke. Thank you.
Yeah,
so much.
I'm glad you did. Also, I have to say the props that you get on the back from Patton Oswalt, a favorite comedian of mine. So it's recommended by great folks just the same. Congratulations.
We were very lucky with the blurbs. Willie Nelson gave me my first blurb, and after that, it was just like, oh, thank you.
He's at the top of this as well.
We were very, very lucky with the blurbs on this one.
It's a great book. Congratulations. And thank you for
you're so kind. Thank you, sir, and thanks to your wonderful audience. I host the primetime programming on Sirius XM Progress every night, and we're a free podcast called the John Fugelsang Podcast that comes out every day. And Luke, I love your show. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Peace.